You know, it's not even Halloween yet, but millions of kids already know what they want for Christmas, a new video game system called Nintendo 64.
Nintendo's new game machine is 64 bits, making it the most powerful machine on the market.
It's me, Mario! Hello!
The Nintendo 64 released during a really interesting era in gaming history. Game companies were transitioning away from cartridge-based media to newer, sleeker CD-based media for their games. In fact, Nintendo's main competitors at the time, Sony and Sega, had both released CD-based consoles several years before the Nintendo 64 released. So why did Nintendo decide not to follow this trend in the gaming industry and release a fully cartridge-based console? Well, there's a few reasons. The first of which was speed. Cartridges were significantly faster at loading chunks of memory when compared to CD-ROMs. Just stop and think for a minute about how little you had to wait when entering different areas or levels in games like Super Mario 64 or Banjo-Kazooie. Load times on the system were practically non-existent, and that was due to the way that its games were built. Nintendo 64 games use solid-state memory to store game data, whereas CD-ROMs use optical-based memory read through the use of a laser. The system can grab a chunk of memory from the game pack's ROM memory and transfer it to its RAM almost instantly, so load times were practically eliminated in many cases. Compared to the rather long load times we see on the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn due to having to spin up the data needed every time the game loads, and we can clearly see the advantage cartridges had when it came to speed. Just think solid-state drives versus hard disk drives. A solid-state drive is significantly faster but can hold less memory, whereas a hard disk drive is much slower but has a larger capacity for the same amount of money. That was the debate going on in the 90s and early 2000s over cartridges versus CDs. Another big factor in Nintendo's choice to go with cartridges was the effect that adding a disk drive onto the console would have had on the price. Nintendo was very adamant about keeping the price of the console for consumers under the $200 mark, and if they added a disk drive, that just wouldn't have been feasible. The N64 was the lowest priced console at release of the generation at $199.99, and that definitely had an effect on its sales. It also forced Nintendo's competitors to lower their prices as well in order to stay competitive. The next advantage that cartridges have over discs is their modular nature. Now what do I mean when I say modular? I mean that parts can be added or subtracted from the game pack in accordance with a specific game's needs. For example, the ability to save to a cartridge. I'm sure many people have noticed that you can play and save a lot of N64 games without the use of a controller pack or memory card. This is due to the modular nature of the game packs. Developers could choose to have things like extra flash memory or battery-based RAM included on the board for their game in order to enable saving to the game pack. Game CDs are read-only memory, so if you're going to be using CDs, you also need to use memory cards if you want to use save files and not passwords for your game. Now, of course, there are many N64 games that didn't have the ability to save to the game pack, but memory isn't the only thing that can be added to the board. In the case of Dobus no Mori, a game I just recently unboxed on my channel, there was no extra memory in the game pack, but it does have an internal clock on the board to allow for time-based events in the game. This wouldn't have been possible on the PlayStation because it lacks an internal clock, and you of course cannot add a clock onto a CD-ROM. There are of course other advantages to the modular nature of the game packs, like the ability to swap certain parts out if the game stops working, but that's more of an advantage for the consumers, I guess. Another advantage that would have been of particular interest to Nintendo was the inherent difficulty in making illegal copies of a cartridge-based game. Discs are available to just about anyone, and that makes making copies of disc-based games relatively easy to do, especially during the era of the N64. But cartridges are proprietary to the maker, making them many times more difficult to copy. If I gave you a Nintendo 64 game pack and said, "Here, make this," I bet almost everyone watching this would have no idea what to do. And that inherent copy protection is a great advantage that cartridges have over discs. And last but not least, one of the biggest advantages of cartridges to me as a retro game enthusiast is their durability. Cartridges last a long time, and you don't really need to be gentle with them. That's due again to the way that cartridges are built. The pins that allow the transfer of data between the system and the game pack and the board of the game itself are protected by the plastic casing of the game, and therefore aren't very easily exposed to things like liquids, dust, or scratches that could render the game unplayable. However, discs on the other hand are very susceptible to damage. It's not uncommon to find an old disc covered in scratches and completely unusable because the owner didn't utilize the utmost caution when handling it. And the target audience for a lot of games at the time, and even now, is kids. And as we all know, kids aren't usually the best when it comes to keeping things from getting damaged. But with something like a cartridge, it's really hard even for kids to do enough damage to break the game, especially when compared to discs. So those are the 5 biggest advantages to cartridges in my opinion. Sounding pretty good, right? Well, before we render a verdict on Nintendo's decision, let's talk about the disadvantages. Number 1, and probably the biggest disadvantage cartridges had when compared to discs, was their rather lackluster storage space. N64 game packs at launch had a maximum capacity of only 12 megabytes. They did eventually reach 64 megabytes in 1999, but that was still less than a tenth of the 650 megabytes available to CD-ROMs. This small capacity was considered unacceptable to a lot of developers, many jumping ship to rivals like Sony. Notably, Square's Final Fantasy series was moved to the PlayStation. The developer stating the pre-rendered cutscenes and high-quality audio they had planned for subsequent games just wouldn't fit on a Nintendo 64 cartridge. And many other third-party developers felt the same way. The Nintendo 64's poor storage capacity was one of the biggest factors in the console's extreme lack of third-party support. Another big disadvantage cartridges had was their much higher cost of production. PlayStation games reportedly only cost $1 per game to produce, while N64 games cost upwards of $30 per game, and that cost would inevitably be passed on to the consumer. Nintendo 64 games cost significantly more than PlayStation games at around $65 to $70 for first-party titles and $75 to $80 for third-party titles, in some rare cases even going for over $100. On the other hand, PlayStation games were usually only $40 to $50, and that was much more appealing to consumers. The prices did eventually come down after a while, but by then the damage was already done. The high cost of production was also a big factor in the little third-party support Nintendo saw on the 64, as many developers were lured in by the higher profit margin they could see when developing for the Sony PlayStation or the Sega Saturn. The third and final big disadvantage that cartridges had when compared to discs was the relatively long time it took to produce a cartridge. A single batch of cartridges reportedly took 2 weeks or more to produce, while CD-based games can be produced at the same volume in the matter of only a few weeks. You might be wondering why that's such a big deal, but you have to think from the perspective of a developer. Longer production times meant developers had to attempt to predict how well their games would sell before release. If a game went out of stock, it would take a long time to provide more copies to retailers, and if a game didn't sell well, you were stuck with a surplus of unsold games. But with discs, developers could have more of a wait-and-see attitude about their games. If it sold well, they could get more copies out in a timely manner, and if it didn't sell well, they weren't stuck with a ton of unsold games. Definitely a big advantage of disc-based media at the time. So, was Nintendo right in using cartridges for the N64? From a pure sales standpoint, well, no. The Nintendo 64 sold 33 million units in its lifetime, which is definitely nothing to sneeze at, but its largest competitor, the PlayStation 1, sold 103 million units in its lifetime. That's a difference of 70 million units. Now, of course, this wasn't due only to the difference in media, but that probably played a big role. If Nintendo had more third-party support and lower game prices, they may have seen much better sales. But sales aren't everything. I'm personally really happy Nintendo decided to use cartridges on the N64 because I love cartridges. There's something so satisfying about popping one into a system that I just can't get enough of. Also, from a preservation standpoint, I'm really happy many of my favorite games are on cartridges. If they were on discs, who knows how long they last. I also really appreciate the lack of long load times afforded to us by the solid-state nature of the game pack and the ease of refurbishment thanks to its modular parts. And at the end of the day, we all have clearly seen that you can make some really fun games on an N64 cartridge. I mean, a ton of the greatest games of all time are N64 games. So is the lack of storage space really that big of an issue? Let me know in the comments what you think about Nintendo's decision to use cartridges over discs for the N64, and if you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like, it really helps me out. If you're interested in seeing more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks for watching everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Hack out.
Wow.
That's going to drive parents nuts.
Is it ever?
Kids are going to want it. The parents are not going to be able to find it. It's one of those classic Christmas things, and I can't believe we're talking about Christmas already.
I know. You know what? I can hardly figure out paddle pong. I don't know how the kids play this thing. You ever sat down with a kid when they start playing these things?
No, they're very good at it.
Oh, they're excellent. Let's head over to Perry and Ron right now for sports night. They look like a couple of electronic game players.
You play Nintendo?
No.
No, you know what either do I?
Well, I can, but not very well.
You guys ever played Space Invaders?